Welcome to episode 110 of the Ask Historians podcast. Today we'll be talking with CommieSpaceInvader, aka Joe, about Marxist historiography and contemporary academia. CommieSpaceInvader is a moderator on the subreddit, and he's also one of our resident experts on the Holocaust, Nazi Germany, and Wehrmacht war crimes. While we do get into some of the basics of what makes Marxist historiography, listeners shouldn't approach the episode as a systematic introduction to the theory and methodology of Marxism as a historiographical method. Instead, I'll be linking several threads on the subreddit which explain the principles of Marxist historiography much more systematically and in depth. With that said, let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today we're talking with CommieSpaceInvader, aka Joe, about Marxist historiography. Joe, welcome.
Welcome, and thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. So, before we begin, what would you say Marxist historiography is?
That's a really big question, actually. I was planning to start off our whole discussion here with a little anecdote, one that I rather enjoy a lot from history, actually. And it's about how after World War I, when revolution swept Germany, there existed the Munich Soviet Republic, which was this left-wing rule in post-war Germany in the aftermath of the defeat of the Germans. And one of the first measures they took was to open the university to everyone interested. And so there were no more tuitions, no more fees, and everyone could study whatever subject they wished. Every subject except one, really, and that was history. The Munich Soviet Republic basically argued that history is a tool of the oppressor. It's a reactionary science used to legitimize class rule by the bourgeoisie against the workers, and that's why it should not be taught in universities. And I think this illustrates something that's rather interesting, namely that I would say that today there is two types of historians, the critical ones and the affirmative ones, or the people who write critical history and the people who write affirmative history. And with critical history, I don't mean specifically like the schools of critical race theory or something similar. I just mean the general sense of, are you trying to justify power, to affirm power, and to affirm nationalist or similar narratives? Or are you trying to critically engage with them in a historiographical sense? And this is where Marxism comes in for me, because over the past 100 years, since the Munich Soviet Republic has outlawed the study of history, I think there has been enormous movement in terms of how historiography engages with its themes and subjects, and how critical it has become of certain aspects of how history is used and told to justify modern conditions. And this is where Marxism really comes in, because Marxism played a huge part in becoming critical of existing conditions, also as a historian. And so I would say that at its basis, what Marxist historiography is, in effect, is the sort of historiography that tends to engage critically with existing conditions in the past as well as in contemporary times. And that takes as I think Enzo Traverso called it, the most vigorous emancipatory body of thought, referring to Marxism, seriously in terms of how we investigate history.
So it's Marxist historiography is kind of like a tool for from a Marxist lens to critically analyze the past, but the emphasis being on critical analysis. Is your point?
Yes, I would say that the essence that makes up Marxist historiography and the Marxist body of thought is a dedication to a certain kind of emancipatory principle that is very much in line with the Enlightenment that preceded Marx, the Hegelians and the people who wrote about human rights and the idea of equality, because leaving aside the more specific aspects of Marx, meaning the materialist approach and the idea of class conflict as something that drives history forward, the essence of Marxist thought is that there is a problem in terms of people being exploited in an economical sense and in a cultural and ideological sense. And it is our task as philosophers or as people trying to understand this world to critically engage with this oppression and to, how do you say, to do our part for the emancipation of the people in a very holistic sense.
Okay, and what what would you say in concrete terms would define something that could be called Marxist historiography? Like, how would you define Marxist historiography in as kind of like the main methodological or theoretical principles behind it?
I think at this point in time, it's a bit difficult to bring it all down to more specific or concrete aspects, because Marxist historiography has become very heterodox and diverse in recent years. But I think that what defines Marxist historiography specifically, I'd say, is the idea of approaching history from a standpoint of materialism in part, meaning economic relations being a prime point of interest, as well as an approach to history that takes the view from below, meaning it takes a look at history not from the point of view of the people in power, the people who control society, but the people like the farmer, the laborer, the woman, of course, and the people who we don't tend to think of as part of history that often, at least not in the sense of the Rankian sense of history, the history of the great white men and their achievements.
There's kind of overlap there. I agree with what was the name for it? The French. I think it's a largely French history or not French, but the history of the historyless. Like there's a specific like historiographical school. I mean, I'm not saying it's the same thing, but I'm saying there's overlap with it. No, I mean there's like it's kind of overlaps with the subalterns approach, though obviously it's not, Marxism is not the same thing as subaltern studies. And there's also in Spanish it's referred to La Historia de los sin historia, the history of the historyless. But I'm not sure, and I think it's related to the analysis, but I'm not quite sure.
Well, I think that you mentioning the subaltern takes us right into the heart of the matter because, in fact, I had to read up a little on Gramsci for my dissertation research that I'm currently conducting, and the term subaltern as it is used by Spivak and others today in terms of subaltern studies really has its origins within Marxist thought. It was Gramsci who talked about the subaltern as the people who do not have access to the structures of power and the means to produce the dominant or the hegemonic discourse. Of course, Gramsci didn't use discourse, but what he means with cultural hegemony would be reasonably referred to as discourse. So the term subaltern and this whole field of thinking about the people who don't have a history, the people who don't usually show up in the historical record and are not thought of as part of history generally, that owes at least parts of its body of thought to the Marxist Gramsci. So this again goes back to my point I made earlier that the whole idea to view history from below and to give a voice to the people who don't usually have one, neither in terms of social access to power nor in terms of how their history is written, is in part at least something that has come about thanks to developments in Marxist thought.
It's, I mean, it begs the question, let's take a step back for a second. Was there ever a kind of, did Marx have a coherent historiographical method? Was there a Marxist historiography under Marx, or was it something kind of cobbled together from Marx's writings by his, let's call them, successors or followers?
Well, I think that if you read Marx, there emerges a picture of how history functions. History as the successions of different class dichotomies and the historical materialism that drives history forward, where I tend to see his successors or various successors at work is the idea of treating historical materialism as a science. You know, the whole idea, the Leninist idea of Marxism is not an ideology per se, but Marxism is a science. And with the science of Marxism, we can understand history, we can understand society, we can understand economics, we can understand basically everything about the human condition. And I don't think this is necessarily found in the writings of Karl Marx, but something that got adopted later on and had results of varying success and validity, to say the least.
Yeah, one of the things that I writings that I frequently cite in the on the subreddit is an essay, an excellent essay by English Marxist Perry Anderson, and he wrote this excellent 70-page, I think it's about 70 pages, essay on the Asiatic mode of production, and which was one of Marx's theories from. They didn't really ever develop fully during his lifetime, and Perry Anderson shows that basically it was a kind of single category which explained supposedly, or a single category for all socioeconomic, all societies and their socioeconomic systems. If they were in Asia, and some Soviet historians tried to say it also applies to the Americas, the pre-Columbian Americas, and it was like a system where it was like, okay, theocratic, something, authoritarian, blah, 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 da, da, da. And And Perry Anderson just showed in those 70 pages, one, Marx didn't know what he was talking about. He just did not know what he was talking about. He was basing himself on secondary and tertiary sources who are all white guys from Europe who also never actually went to the countries they were writing about, like John Stuart Mill's father, John Mill. He based his stuff on India, on John Mill's notes, and John Mill also never went to India. And then, so number two, and then also he only used the term Asiatic production once. He used it in different senses, used this concept in different ways throughout his life. They were contradictory. But also, what happened was that the Soviet manualists who tried to make this kind of systematic catechism, like, if you're real Roman Catholic, about catechism, this very catechismic, idea of like systematizing all of Marx's ideas, and the kind of Frankenstein monster, the pieces of this idea, even though they were kind of incoherent, into this one thing, and said, no, this is coherent, and now this one concept, Asiatic mode of production, explains the socioeconomic systems of everything from ancient Egypt to the Ming Dynasty in China in the modern era, and it's just yeah, it was bad.
I am no Roman Catholic, but I am certainly familiar with catechism. So yeah, the whole idea of systematizing all this. I mean, as you know, I come from the field of the study of Nazism and the Third Reich, and I have read my share of very, very orthodox writing from Eastern Germany that supposedly explains Nazism, and it's all very straightforward. So like, you read these introductions to these books, and there it says, well, as the 31st Congress of the Socialist Unity Party of Germany has decreed, fascism is definitely the most perverse form of bourgeois rule, and the working class was nothing but suppressed, and so on and so forth. And it's all like, it's empirically sound, but theoretically and from its interpretation of history, it's terrible. It's terrible scholarship. And this is where, again, the problem comes in trying to refine Marx and the writings of Marx into this very coherent scientific kind of manual of how to interpret the world, when it's really about, like with pretty much every kind of theoretical or methodological approach, it's about trying to develop it in, or let's say with every theoretical approach, it's about trying to develop a sensible methodology for what you're trying to achieve with it. And I think the most interesting Marxist historiography, where you have things like the history of everyday life from the 70s and the Marxist Historians circle in Britain, or the advent of social history in general, drew a lot from Marx, but they didn't try to make whatever Marx wrote into this coherent body that not only gives you a theoretical outlook on the world, but also delivers you a methodology with it that can't be deviated from.
Yeah, it's a very orthodox, straitjacket kind of Marxist historiography.
Exactly, and I mean, when we look at how Marxist historiography has developed since then, I mean, it's a good example to talk about the kind of like social history or everyday life history approach to or school of thought when it comes to historiography, because there you see a very clever way of adopting certain Marxist principles. When you have when you think about that, you have the subaltern who usually cannot speak, meaning they don't leave a trace in the historical record. How do you approach learning something about these people conceivably? And one idea or one inspiration is you think about them as a class. And when you think about them as a class, you think about their economic conditions. So you have these social historians trying to figure out from surviving records, what people ate, what they drank, what bread cost for them, and so on and so forth. And from the myriad of these sources that have long been neglected, and as someone who has looked into them, are kind of boring to read. I mean, who likes to read hundreds upon hundreds of pages of statistics of bread prices or something similar? But from that, it is possible, from when you're informed with a certain understanding of what they mean in terms of practicality and what they mean in terms of shaping cultural interests and ideological and political interests, then there emerges a picture that can actually give the subaltern a voice in a certain sense. Don't get me wrong, I think these approaches still have their limitations in some way, but this really shows how intellectually invigorating the approach with a Marxist outlook can be, I think.
Yeah, it's I got my undergraduate degree in the University of Havana, and they tend to contrast Marxist historiography in the 19th century with 19th century and like early 20th century with the positivism. So basically their version of things, their explanation is that in the 19th century you see these kind of two approaches to history, which had kind of been never really it was still coming into its own as a discipline, and it was no longer just a bunch of chronicles of this happened and this happened. And you had gotten this kind of artistic flourish in the 18th century with, Voltaire and Edward Gibbon and all these others writing about it. But as the 19th century moved on, there was this interest in trying to turn it into a science of some kind, because science equals legitimacy. And so the positivist approach was just scientifically figure out how to scientifically organize these facts, and these scientifically organized facts are legitimate because of our method is great. And then it didn't really change the focus from kings and battles and politicians, high politics. And theirs was, the Marx, Marx trying to say, actually we should see, where what are the bases of these societies in order to truly understand them and unlock the past. But I mean, it is still ultimately tied in some way to the political project, if you just thinking about it. Like what at least Marx's writings in particular, because the reason that he wanted it to become, or the reason a lot of them wanted it to become a science, was that because of Marx's idea that society is like a series of steps, and each step is progressive and it's slowly stepping towards communism. Then if Marxist historiography was a science, and the prediction was that, eventually we'll see the emancipation of the proletariat, then science says that history will go towards communism. And that's a great boost for your legitimacy if you're building a political movement.
Absolutely. And I mean, in a lot of cases of the, let's call it state socialist historiography of the 20th century, I have to admit I'm not familiar with Cuba, but I'm slowly working my way through Yugoslav historiography, and also am quite familiar with East German historiography. And these things are inseparable, both from the political project, as it's even more obvious than in other cases, and they also are very strongly tied to this positivism of the 19th century. I mean, this is something that Marx also does. It's classes. I mean, Marx explains why there are classes, but in many ways, these are basically primordial things. Like there are always classes, and they always exist, and they will always be in conflict, and they are basically a given, and they shape every individual's agency that is within them. And it took basically until people like E.P. Thompson, who said, well, a class is not a given that just not a thing in the world that just exists merely because it is necessary, but it is something that is created through social practices and created through a feeling of belonging and collective action. So Thompson, as a historian, writes about how modern proletariat class, emerged in the 19th century through workers' practices, at the same time writing as a historian as part of a movement that has the explicit aim of having class consciousness of the proletariat evolve. Which is interesting because it's basically, he attacks the positivism of orthodox Marxism or orthodox Marxist historiography, but his own work is inseparable from his political activism to create a workers' consciousness in 1950s Britain.
What would you say is the state of Marxist historiography right now? Like, is Marxist? Are there major Marxist historiographical schools right now?
Well, schools. I know of Marxist historians who write very interesting work today. Like I in my personal work, I work a lot with Enzo Traverso, who's an Italian Marxist historian who writes about the modern origins of Nazi genocide and violence, and who works from a model of the idea that Nazi terror is the import of colonial rule and structure to the internal state. Like, it's not externalized as Britain and France do with their colonies, but it's the application of the colonial method to your own people. And I think that's a very interesting approach to this topic. But in terms of schools, I think
No, I was gonna ask, like, English Marxism, because I know that was a significant movement.
There was definitely the like the Hobsbawm historian circle of the Communist Party, and also like the social history they pioneered. But I think that in recent years, social history as defined by the Marxists like Hobsbawm and Thompson has not really been that en vogue or practice that much. I mean, there is the legacy in what we today would call cultural history of taking the view from below, but a strictly materialist, class-based approach like these people suggested, and which was popular in the 60s and 70s especially, has shown serious limitations in trying to understand certain aspects of history. And I think that's a reason why it's not practiced that much anymore. Plus, we have seen the rise of various critical approaches to individual topics, which has a Marxist legacy. I think it's fair to say that something like critical post-colonialism and critical whiteness and critical race studies all do have a Marxist legacy in that they do build themselves from what is commonly referred to as critical theory with a capital C and a capital T, meaning Adorno and Horkheimer. But they are not explicitly Marxist, in my impression, in that they tend to eschew a more materialist and class-based approach.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely kind of a legacy. like Marx, a lot of the baggage that Marxism, at least classical Marxist historiography, had, kind of ate up. The schools are kind of that hamstrung them, but yeah, I agree. It's definitely influenced. It's kind of like the good points got absorbed, like the points where Marxist historiography was making incisive, important like criticisms and like underlining things as this is important and it was actually right. Some of those things have been kind of incorporated into other schools, but it's like Marxism as a historiographical movement, as a movement, not individuals, but as a movement, is kind of petered out. I agree.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this can be in part chalked up to the serious limitations this approach tended to display. Like, I just read a book by historian Geoff Ely, which is called A Crooked Line, and which traces the development from social history to cultural history in the 70s and 80s. And he mentions rightly that, for example, when the whole aspect of gender history rose out of these social movements in the 60s, it really tended to show the limitations of a classical materialist and class-based approach to this sort of history, because you can't simply explain sufficiently the role of women in the past and in current society just with a class-based analysis. As much as some people would like to do that still, it leaving out specific formations, ideological formations of the patriarchy and so on and so forth, just doesn't cut it, really, in terms of explanatory potential.
Yeah, and and it hasn't been that great on Marxist historiography hasn't necessarily been that great on race either, especially when white European Marxists were writing about countries that were not their expertise, but kind of they thought, well, this is working class. I can write about this this group of people I've never actually spoken to.
Yes, returning to the Asiatic mode of production problem that encapsulates a lot of it. Like, it's difficult when you have, and that again is a problem of the catechism of Marx, is it's difficult when you have somebody writing about the specific conditions of the English and maybe French working class at a specific point in time, and then trying to transfer these ideas to, let's say, the subaltern in India under British colonialism, or African societies struggling with Europeans arriving there. That doesn't. There's something that must get lost in translation, and if you don't want that, what you're gonna produce is not gonna end up very great.
I wanted to take the opportunity to talk today also a little bit about some overlap between pop culture and academia, which is that there is it's not as popular as it was a year or 2 years ago, but there's still this meme online about an attempt by Marxists, specifically quote cultural Marxists, to infiltrate academia, and that it was thought up through the Frankfurt School. And what is all of this? And what is the Frankfurt School?
Well, what is all of this in reference to cultural Marxism is, you can sum that up in one word. It's actually bullshit. What the Frankfurt School is a little more complicated than that. But let's start. I think it's best to start at the beginning, where all stories tend to start, and start with the actual Frankfurt School, which is often accused of having pioneered this nefarious agenda. basically, what the Frankfurt School is, it's a philosophical movement that is also inspired by Marxism, but tries to grapple with the fact that, proletarian revolution has not materialized. The modern world has produced the horrors of Nazism, and we need to think differently about how to approach the world and its analysis. Specifically, we need to get away from the idea of the proletariat being the revolutionary subject that will bring emancipation to people. So, Adorno and Horkheimer, in essence, are saying that the emancipation of the people will not arrive through the revolution of the working class, but through critically expanding one's own consciousness, which is why it's a critical theory, because they contend that every theory must by necessity be very holistic and critical of existing conditions. So if you don't produce a theory or a study that is critical of existing conditions, nothing is ever going to change, and the people will not be in a position to emancipate themselves from the conditions that oppress them. That's basically the gist of critical theory. And obviously, because that sounds vaguely menacing to certain people politically, and additionally because Adorno and Horkheimer were two Jews who had to flee Nazi Germany, various right-wing people or very paleo-conservative people came up with the idea that, these two Jews are conspiring to destroy Western values. And it all has this very unsavory undertone of anti-Semitism, even in the name, with the cultural Marxism thing, which is a reference to what the Nazis referred to as cultural Bolshevism, meaning the idea that, Jewish Bolshevism is going to destroy all of our culture. And because they don't understand Adorno and Horkheimer, because Horkheimer and Adorno are very, very Western in their values, in the sense that for them, the movement they refer to is the Enlightenment, meaning the equality of the people and the Kantian ideal of emancipating oneself from the intellectual and cultural and political shackles that binds one. And so, in essence, they are referring to what makes up the very core of Western value, and within that, despite the dialectic they posit for the Enlightenment, but within that lies the key to liberating oneself. So what Adorno and Horkheimer are actually saying is that, you need to learn the stuff that we learn in Western Civ 101 in order to become free. I'm simplifying this all a bit, but that's basically the gist of the Frankfurt School. And so to say that these people conspired to destroy the West, whatever that is supposed to mean, is rather absurd on its face, but it fits the worldview of certain people well, because, they're academics and they're Jews and they write complicated sentences and I don't understand what they say, so they're probably out to get me.
Yeah, and it's also, for some reason, I'm not sure if we should even name him, because that'll just get us flamed by his fans, but let's just say that there's a currently popular pseudo-intellectual who seems to overlap this group and the so-called, I guess, the kind of, there's kind of overlap between the cultural Marxism and calling them all postmodernists, which isn't actually the same thing, but it kind of online, it seems to, they both kind of like seem to get thrown around as kind of like interchangeable. And it also probably has to do with, these people are writing long things that we don't really understand, and that's threatening.
Yeah, I mean, I can see how they fit together in some way, in terms of I don't understand it and it's vaguely menacing, because I mean, postmodernism in essence tells you nothing you know is true because it's all narrative. That means that that just because something's a narrative or the product of a social discourse doesn't mean it's less effective or not true for the people who experience it. It doesn't matter. But if somebody comes up to you and says to you, everything you know is wrong, I see where that is kind of vaguely menacing to some people. And combine that with people who tell you that, everything good or everything that deserves to be called theory is something that criticizes the way things currently are, is also pretty menacing if the way things currently are mean that you are the group in power. So if you're a white male who's straight and of economic wealth, there are people who will tell you, well, you are part of the structural problem that prevents us all from emancipating ourselves from the oppression we face. And because you want to maintain the narrative that you're still a good person in essence, you will say, well, that's bullshit. And together with those people who tell me everything I know is wrong, they must be, related somehow and work on some nefarious conspiracy to destroy, I don't know, to take away my video games and tell me I can't make sexist jokes anymore. I don't fully grasp this whole movement of people agitating on the internet to make racist jokes.
Yeah.
I don't
The
know.
I mean, and I mean, there does seem to, there is this weird overlap between this I mean, we're kind of talking about this because there is there's this pop culture criticism that academia is infiltrated by Marxists. As someone who's actually trained in Marxist historiography, I'm not sure I would agree with that. Um, but also that they spread the cultural Marxism thing, which was popularized apparently by the Swedish Bresch. What was his name? Breivik, right? Who's the cultural Marxism and the Frankfurt School thing was popularized very recently when Breivik, the guy who massacred all the kids off that island in Sweden, wrote about it in his manifesto, and somehow his culture, his manic rantings in that document got popularized, and all of a sudden the Marxists in academia is just now describes this horrible threat, existential threat, really, to the existence and survival of Western civilization. Yeah.
This is I don't sorry I this is stupid. That's what you really can say about it, because it's really it goes back to one of the points I think I made in the beginning, is that when you engage as a historian, or generally in any of the social sciences or humanities, with your subject of study, broadly speaking, there is a way to engage critically with what you're dealing with and to engage affirmatively with what you're dealing with, because we're all the products of the society that surrounds us, and our work in academia must engage with what we're encountering. Like, you can't write about Nazism without engaging in some of the narratives that revolve around that period of the past. I mean, I live in Germany. It's rather obvious how that's gonna work, writing about Nazism in Germany. But you tend to engage with these things in either a critical or in an affirmative way. And I think that people like Breivik and others who believe in these things have a serious and fundamental problem understanding or dealing with the idea that not everyone's content with the way they want society to be, meaning with a society that produces oppression and exploitation for people who are not like them. And so I think this whole idea of every academic trying to write critically about a certain subject must have some kind of nefarious agenda and belong to a conspiracy of all academia to destroy the Western way of life, which is never really defined anyway. It just means, no foreigners and women in the kitchen for these people. It must be part of some kind of, evil plan. And that's just, some people would argue that's not healthy, but actually a psychosis.
Well, I mean, the thing about the whole Western values thing is, I mean, historically speaking, what the West has really, I mean, I think we were talking about this with David Fauser, episodes back. What the West even means is very, very changing. I mean, right now it's kind of just code for, has some vague connection to the, a study of an admiration of like classical Greece and Rome, and you're white. But I mean, like, if who was it that wrote that Europe stops at the Pyrenees? I think that was Voltaire. Wasn't that Voltaire? Or was that Montesquieu?
I think Montesquieu.
Yeah, Montesquieu. Yeah, Europe stops at the Pyrenees. Spain is in Europe. What does the West count for? Russia was always, long referred to as an Eastern country, as an Eastern potentate of some kind, not really connected to the West. Do the Nordic do the Nordic countries, which were never occupied by Rome, do they count as West? They were West and Western civilization just is kind of this empty term, which in practice just kind of it's not just that it's empty. It's this very superficial term which just serves as a convenient kind of code for a very specific political kind of ideology.
Yeah, I mean, it only works if you have the other, who is not the West. I mean, that's true of all identity concepts, really. But dealing with the Balkans, I encountered this rather often, where you have, in the Balkans, you have a very strong Roman legacy. I just was in Niš, in Serbia, for my own research, and there they have a monument for a Roman emperor, I forgot which one, who was born there. So you have a Roman emperor born in Niš, but the Balkans are decidedly not part of this Western narrative for the most part. But I think, and this brings us in a sort of way back to the Marxism thing. I think that where Marxism fits very well into this paradigm of the West, how it narrates itself, is this idea that history is this constant social progress that has a teleological aim, which is achieved through, democracy, through scientific advancement, through the struggles of the proletariat, and will eventually reach some kind of end. this is, I think, something that people who admire the West very deeply, like, I don't know, Fukuyama writes about the end of history, who says, well, now that the Soviet Union has fallen in 1990, now history is at an end and everyone will become a liberal democracy and nothing will ever happen again. And this jives very well with, a sort of orthodox Marxist history perspective where, once we have achieved communism, after the dictatorship of the proletariat and socialism is over, history is over. Like, what's gonna happen that's gonna be interesting? Nothing. And it's a very narrow definition of history, but I think what encapsulates the West is history is driven forward towards a teleological aim, and that is achieved via progress of some sort, and we're at the forefront of that progress, and we need to maintain this position at the forefront of this progress.
Yeah, hopefully the public, the what's it called, all this attention over the supposed like cultural Marxism and all the rest, and Marxist infiltration of academia and all that stuff. Hopefully the unintended result of it will be that, at least the pushback against that will help explain to people, that, why it's bad, and hopefully they'll be a little bit more informed about, what, some of these concepts actually, really mean. So out of I realized that we didn't actually clear up at the top of the show, but out of curiosity, would you consider yourself a Marxist historian?
I definitely, in my own like scientific work, use Marxist concepts, in that I think I've made this clear through several Monday Methods posts on the sub and other posts I've written, that in my own work I work a lot with ideas that come directly from Gramsci and a couple of other Marxist thinkers who have contemplated the how power functions and how power is maintained and how relations of power within the how relations of power within the modern capitalist world actually work. Like, you have Gramsci, who goes on how consent is manufactured because there can be no dominance without consent of those who are being dominated. And in that sense, I use Marxist thinking because I think that it is one of the most intellectually vigorating and at the same time most emancipatory bodies of thought. And so I don't write materialist class history, but in a certain sense I do Marxist historiography, yes.
Yeah. I personally, I wouldn't call myself a Marxist historian. Though I do definitely take elements such as the emphasis on class, but I use them in the same way. I'm closer to like people like Fernand Braudel, who the second school of the analysis in the latter half of the 20th century, who took class into account and class interests, looking at, okay, you've got these peasants who keep getting exploited by these, noble lords. You've got all these elements, but then situate it within the context of a broader framework, like, the what Braudelian historiography is kind of like incorporated and been kind of evolved into Atlantic history at this point. So that wider framework, but I mean it's kind of like what we said earlier. It's the they're taking the good points that they made, the good criticisms that were, in implicit in Marx, and just kind of incorporating that into, more broader frameworks.
I think that's really interesting. You say that you're a fan of Braudel and the Atlantic history school of thought, and also considering yourself
and Wallerstein
and considering yourself probably not a Marxist historian but a Marxian historian, which is interesting because my work is approaching things from the complete opposite side of the spectrum, because what I write is in effect, in a sort of sense, inspired by microhistory, which is the exact opposite of the Braudelian approach, meaning you don't look at, longue durée and structures over time, but you look at, people in their immediate vicinity of life, and looking at them in their immediate situation of life in a very, very close sense, like you put them under a magnifying glass. And while you relate that to a larger context, I'm specifically not concerned with larger structures over long periods of time. And the fact that we both can reasonably say that we are influenced by Marxist and Marxian thought, but do exact methodological opposites in our work, just goes to show how deeply ingrained in a positive way this whole line of thinking is by now in so many different approaches.
Definitely, that's a very good point. Perfect. Great. So I think this has kind of been an all over the place episode. We've kind of talked about, as they say in Spanish, lo humano y lo divino, from the human to the divine. We've kind of gone all over the place, but I think people will have a kind of a basic grasp of, the kind of the major points of, Marxist historiography and what Marxist historiography looks like today, and kind of also a context of some of the more pop culture references to Marxism in academia and all the rest, which unfortunately have gained traction in the last couple of years. So yeah, Joe, thanks again for coming on.
Thanks again for having me. You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com, and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.